There's a particular kind of hunger that the end of a war leaves behind. It is not the hunger of the body, though the body knows it well enough. It is something deeper, something that gnaws at the marrow of a man's ambitions, at the soft underbelly of his dreams. In the autumn of 1945, when the last of the guns had fallen silent across the Pacific and the boys came home with their medals and their ghosts, America was gripped by this hunger in a way that no one quite had the language to describe. The factories that had built the bombs were retooling themselves for refrigerators. The women who had welded the hulls of destroyers were being handed back their aprons. And the men, the young men especially, those who had walked through fire and come out the other side with a desperate, almost violent need to believe that something better was waiting. These men were hungry in ways that made them dangerous to themselves. It was into this particular hunger that a man named Clarence Verity arrived, seemingly from nowhere, in the small but ambitious city of Columbus, Ohio, carrying a leather briefcase, a pocket watch that had belonged to no one, and a smile that seemed to have been engineered for the specific purpose of making other people feel that they had already been chosen for something extraordinary. He was 34 years old, though he could appear younger or older depending on the light and the needs of the room. He had dark hair that he wore parted precisely on the left side, and his eyes were the color of shallow water over sand, neither blue nor green, but something in between that made you feel you could see the bottom, even when you could not. He rented a room above a hardware store on East Broad Street and spent his first 2 weeks in Columbus doing nothing more threatening than drinking coffee in diners and listening. This is what distinguished Clarence Verity from the common grifter, from the ordinary confidence man who tumbles into a town and begins immediately performing his tricks. Verity listened. He sat in the booths of Woolworth's lunch counters and heard the veterans talking about the small loans they couldn't secure, about the farms they'd hoped to buy that the banks had already swallowed, about the businesses they dreamed of while lying in the mud of some Pacific atoll. He attended the church socials and the Rotary Club meetings that were open to the public, and he heard the older men, the ones who had stayed home and prospered slightly during the war years, speak of their anxieties about the new America taking shape around them. He visited the employment offices and read the desperation in the postures of men who had survived things that would have broken God, and who now could not find work managing a shoe store. He took notes in a small brown notebook, not of names but of needs. He was cartographing desire. He was surveying the landscape of want. What he assembled from all this listening was a product, not a physical thing, not something you could hold or smell or use to build a house. The product was a promise, wrapped inside a structure, wrapped inside the language of rational investment. He called it the American Prosperity Syndicate. In a city still intoxicated with the word American, this name alone was nearly enough to open doors. He rented a small office on South High Street, 2 rooms with a window that overlooked a parking lot, and had stationery printed with an eagle at the top and the words, "Founded in the spirit of American ingenuity," in small italics beneath the letterhead. He purchased a second-hand mahogany desk that he polished until it gleamed like something ecclesiastical. He hung on the wall a framed photograph of the skyline of New York City, though he had no connection to New York, because New York in 1945 meant arrival, meant possibility, meant the continent's beating heart. The scheme itself, in its mechanical bones, was not original. It had ancestors reaching back through history, through the promoters of the Dutch tulip bubble, through the Mississippi Company that had ruined an entire nation's savings. There had been Charles Ponzi himself, only 25 years before Verity set up his desk, whose name had already entered the American vocabulary as a kind of warning label that nobody seemed to read. But what Verity understood, and what the historians of fraud so often fail to appreciate, is that the mechanism is never the story. The mechanism is only the body. What gives it life, what makes it walk and breathe and reproduce itself, is the mythology that surrounds it. The mythology Verity created was this. He told his first investors, all of them veterans, all of them men he had selected with the precision of a jeweler sorting stones, that he had discovered during the war. He was vague about which theater of operations, but convincingly vague, the vagueness of a man who has seen things he cannot freely discuss. That he had discovered a network of relationships between small manufacturers in the Midwest and distribution channels in the growing cities of the South and West. He explained with a patience that bordered on tenderness that the real American economy was not what you saw in the newspapers. The real American economy was the space between the producer and the consumer, the gap that middlemen had always controlled and that ordinary citizens had always been excluded from. The American Prosperity Syndicate, he said, was a mechanism for closing that gap, for letting the ordinary citizen in. He asked for $200 per investor, a sum that was substantial but not impossible, the price of roughly 3 weeks of factory work. He promised a return of $40 per month, 20% monthly, which was, of course, an astronomical return, but which Verity framed not as a financial number but as a moral correction. This was what they had always been owed, he said. This was the dividend of their sacrifice. The numbers had a kind of righteousness to them that made the mathematics seem almost beside the point. His first 12 investors were men he had spent weeks cultivating. He knew their names, their wives' names, the names of their children. He knew which of them had a mother in a nursing home, which of them had a truck that needed an engine, which of them had a daughter about to start at Ohio State. He did not use this knowledge manipulatively, or at least not in any way that could be called clumsy. He simply allowed it to inform his conversations, to make them feel known, which is perhaps the most powerful thing one person can do for another. In that first month, he paid each of his 12 investors their $40, not from any business operation, but from the $200 he collected from each of them. He was paying people with their own money, and they could not see it because they did not know they were looking at a mirror. The 12 became 24. The 24 became 50. Not because Verity advertised, not because he went door to door, but because the first 12 men told the story themselves. They told it at church, at the VFW hall, at the barber shop, at the dinner table. And they did not tell it merely as a story about money. They told it as a story about themselves, about the kind of men they were, men who had found the hidden door in the wall of American prosperity and walked through it. This is the true engine of a pyramid scheme, the thing that the regulators and the moralists always struggle to name. It is not greed. Or rather, it is not only greed. It is the human need to be the one who knows, to be the herald of good news, to bring your brother-in-law in from the cold. There was a man named Harold Fitch who became, in those early months, the closest thing Verity had to a lieutenant. Harold was 31, a former sergeant from a town called Zanesville, who had lost 2 fingers on his right hand to frostbite in the Ardennes, and who carried with him, like so many veterans of that winter campaign, a silence at his center that no amount of American optimism could quite fill. Harold had invested $200 that represented almost the entirety of his savings. And when the $40 arrived each month like clockwork, like a small miracle of punctuality, he felt something shift inside him that had been locked in place since before the war. He became a believer with the fervor of a convert, and, like all converts, he proselytized with an urgency that was almost frightening to witness. Harold brought in his brother, his father-in-law, 3 men from his old unit, a neighbor who had worked as a machinist at Curtiss-Wright during the war, and a young woman named Dolores Kwan, who ran a small alterations shop on Fifth Avenue, and who had been saving carefully for years with the intention of buying the building she worked in. It is important to pause here at the name of Dolores Kwan, because she represents something specific in this story, the kind of person for whom Verity's scheme was not tailored, but who was drawn in nonetheless by the gravitational pull of its apparent respectability, by the fact that men like Harold Fitch believed in it, men who had been to war and come back and seemed to know something now about the real nature of things. Dolores invested $300, which she withdrew from the savings account she had been building for 11 years. She was 38 years old, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had come to Columbus by way of San Francisco, and she had lived her entire life in the space between invisibility and suspicion that America reserved for people who looked like her. The war had not changed this in any fundamental way, though some things had shifted at the edges. What the American Prosperity Syndicate offered Dolores was not primarily the money, though the money mattered enormously. What it offered was inclusion in something that called itself American in its very name, a seat at a table from which she had always been turned away. By the spring of 1946, the American Prosperity Syndicate had collected somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000 from approximately 230 investors in Columbus and its surrounding communities. Verity had opened a second office, this one on Broad Street proper, with 2 secretaries, both of them wives of investors, which created an additional layer of social trust. and a receptionist's area with a waiting room that he had furnished with copies of the Wall Street Journal, and 2 leather armchairs that he had purchased from an estate sale. Everything was designed to project solidity, longevity, the quiet confidence of institutions that have outlasted the people who needed them. He had also, by this point, begun to feel the particular pressure that all architects of such structures feel as they build upward and outward. The weight of what is at the top, increasing with every new foundation stone laid below it. The mathematics of his operation were a kind of countdown. Each new investor temporarily solved the problem of paying the existing ones, but in solving it, expanded the problem for the following month. The pyramid did not grow toward the sky so much as it grew toward its own collapse. Each new tier a step closer to the moment when there would simply not be enough new people in the world to feed the ones already inside. But Verity had not been idle. He was not a man who could tolerate the pure fraudster's life of running in place, of generating heat without ever moving. He had spent months in private negotiation with a small, family-owned textile distribution company in Cincinnati called Alderman Brothers, which was struggling with the transition from wartime contracts back to civilian commerce. The deal he offered them was unusual. Essentially, he would provide them with operating capital from his syndicate's pool of funds in exchange for a percentage of their revenue. The Alderman Brothers were skeptical but desperate, and their desperation was the kind that wears the clothing of pragmatism. They signed an agreement. The agreement was real. The revenue it generated was real, though modest, nothing approaching the returns Verity had promised his investors. This real business arrangement gave Verity something invaluable, which was a layer of legitimate activity to gesture toward when investors began asking questions. He could show them paperwork. He could take the more prominent ones on a day trip to Cincinnati to walk through the Alderman Brothers warehouse, to see the bolts of fabric and the shipping manifests and the men loading trucks. He understood that what people need to sustain a belief is not evidence in the scientific sense, not data that can be verified and cross-examined, but rather the experience of having been shown something. The tour of the warehouse was theater. It was the same theater that has sustained religion and nationalism and love. We believe in what we have been invited to witness, even when what we have witnessed is a performance. It was in the summer of 1946 that the first fracture appeared, and it came from the direction no one expected, including Verity himself. It came from Harold Fitch's father-in-law, a man named Eugene Pruitt, who was 67 years old and had spent his entire working life as an accountant for a small insurance company. Eugene had retired the previous year, and when Harold had brought him into the American Prosperity Syndicate, Eugene had invested $400, his Christmas savings from the past 3 years, with a kind of methodical reluctance that was the closest he could come to enthusiasm. Each month, he received his $80, and each month he recorded it in a small ledger with the same care with which he had recorded everything in his life. It was this ledger that undid Clarence Verity. Eugene Pruitt, with the instincts of a man who had spent 40 years staring at numbers until they told him the truth, began to notice something that the other investors were too grateful or too excited to see. He noticed that the dates of his payments followed a pattern that corresponded precisely with the enrollment dates of new investors rather than with any plausible schedule of business revenue. He knew, because Harold had told him eagerly, how many people had joined the syndicate and roughly when. And when he laid this timeline against the record of his own payments, something in the mathematics began to smell wrong, the way a room smells wrong before anyone can say what is in it. He did not go to the police first. He went to Harold. He sat across from his son-in-law at the kitchen table and spread his ledger between them like a map of a country neither of them wanted to enter. And he said, in a voice that was very quiet, that he needed Harold to look at certain things with him. Harold looked. And Harold, who was not a foolish man, who had survived things in Belgium that required a very precise reading of dangerous situations, felt something hollow open up in the center of his conviction. What happened next is perhaps the most human part of this story, and the most painful. Harold did not go immediately to the police either. He went to Verity. He made an appointment, which was a strange formality given how close they had become, and he sat in one of the leather armchairs in the outer office and waited, looking at the Wall Street journals he had never needed to read before. And then he went into the mahogany desk room and sat across from Clarence Verity and told him what his father-in-law had found. And Verity, because he was who he was, did not panic. He nodded slowly, with the measured gravity of a man receiving information he had been expecting, and he said that Harold had found something real, that there was a structural complexity to the way the syndicate operated that he had perhaps not explained sufficiently, and that he would like to arrange a dinner, not a meeting, a dinner, at which he could go through everything in full detail. The dinner was at a steak restaurant downtown, and Verity paid for everything. He brought documents that looked thorough. He spoke for nearly 3 hours with the patience of a man who has nothing to hide and is merely clearing up a misunderstanding. He did not address the specific mathematical concern that Eugene Pruitt had raised, not directly, but he surrounded it with so much warm language, so much apparent transparency and detail, that the concern seemed to dissolve in the heat of it. Harold drove home that night feeling, if not entirely reassured, at least uncertain enough to hesitate. And in the pyramid scheme's particular ecosystem, hesitation is a form of consent. But Eugene Pruitt was not at that dinner, and Eugene Pruitt, in his quiet, methodical way, had already written a letter. He wrote it not to the police, but to the Securities Division of the Ohio State Government, a body that existed but was thinly staffed and frequently overwhelmed by the scale and variety of post-war financial activity. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten in Eugene Pruitt's cramped but perfectly legible accountant's hand, and it laid out his observations with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime organizing chaos into columns. It was the kind of letter that sits in a government inbox for several weeks before anyone reads it, and then sits in someone's hands for several more while they try to determine who should handle it. In the meantime, the scheme continued. By October of 1946, the American Prosperity Syndicate had collected somewhere between $110,000 and $120,000 in total, though Verity's own records, meticulous in some areas, deliberately opaque in others, made an exact accounting difficult, even in retrospect. There were approximately 340 investors across Columbus and 4 satellite communities: Worthington, Whitehall, Groveport, and a pocket of farmland east of Reynoldsburg, where a well-connected investor had brought in a cluster of his neighbors. The investor base had long since expanded beyond the original veteran community to include shop owners, a school teacher, a nurse, 3 pastors from different denominations, and a former city councilman who had retired the previous year and was looking for something useful to do with his time. Dolores Kwan had by this point received a total of $180 from her $300 investment, and she was, on paper, halfway to recovering her principal. She had told 3 people about the syndicate, though she had not pushed them with Harold Fitch's evangelical intensity. One of them had joined, bringing in $200 of her own. Dolores kept her records carefully, as her parents had taught her, and she did not allow herself to spend the monthly payments, but instead returned them to her building purchase savings account, so that the number was growing again, even if more slowly than she had hoped. She thought about the future with a specific quality of longing that was partly hope and partly the protective vigilance of someone who has learned not to trust the ground entirely beneath her feet. It was November, when the investigator from the Securities Division arrived at the South High Street office. His name was Raymond Haas, and he was 30 years old, formerly of the Army Counterintelligence Corps, which had given him a particular set of skills related to the careful investigation of things that did not wish to be investigated. He arrived without announcement in an ordinary wool coat and asked to speak with someone from management about the nature of the organization's business. One of the secretaries, the wife of an investor named Thomas Beale, told him politely that Mr. Verity was in a meeting and asked if he would like to wait. He sat in the leather armchair and read the Wall Street Journal. What followed was not an immediate arrest, not a dramatic unraveling, but rather the slower, more precise process of official scrutiny, which resembles in some ways the action of water on stone, barely perceptible moment to moment, but transformative across time. Haas returned multiple times. He requested documents. He interviewed investors, including Eugene Pruitt, whose letter had by now made its way to the top of a pile that Haas was responsible for. He found discrepancies that were subtle enough that they required explanation, but significant enough that no explanation quite covered them. He was like a man feeling the edges of a hole in the dark, tracing its shape before he could see it. Verity was cooperative in the specific way of a man who has prepared extensively for cooperation. He had a story for everything, and the stories were not implausible. They were merely insufficient, and the insufficiency was only apparent when you pressed in a particular direction for a particular length of time. He understood that Haas was building something, that the visits were not curiosity but architecture, and he began, in late November, to make decisions that would later be read as preparations for flight, though he would have described them at the time as sensible business restructuring. He transferred a portion of the syndicate's funds, which existed across 3 separate bank accounts, into a single account opened under a slightly different business name, the American Prosperity Group, at a bank in Indianapolis, where he was not known. He began spending weekends in Cincinnati, ostensibly on Alderman Brothers' business, though he made no visits to the warehouse on these trips. He purchased, in late November, a one-way train ticket to Chicago, which he did not use, and which was later found among his possessions in a way that made investigators uncertain whether it represented a plan or a decoy. What stopped him, if the word stopped can be applied to something so gradual and so contested, was not Raymond Haas or the Securities Division. It was Harold Fitch. Harold, in the weeks since the kitchen table conversation with his father-in-law, had been living inside a kind of suspended state that he recognized from combat. The period between seeing the danger and being able to act on the scene, when everything continues in its normal motion, but the world has already changed its meaning. He had told himself after the steak dinner that he had been reassured, but reassurance is not the same as certainty, and certainty was what he needed, because the money that was at stake in the American Prosperity Syndicate was not only his, it was his neighbors, his brothers, his father-in-law's, the machinist from Curtis Wright, the 3 men from his unit, men who had shared foxholes with him, whose fear he had breathed in the cold Belgian dark, men whose trust in him was of a specific quality, forged in conditions that civilian life could not replicate or, perhaps, even understand. He thought about these men at night, in the particular way that you think about obligations that you cannot discharge without pain. And in the first week of December 1946, he walked into the Columbus Police Department and asked to speak to whoever handled financial crimes. What he gave them was not evidence in any formal sense. It was testimony, which is a different and in some ways more powerful thing. He told them what he had seen, what his father-in-law had found, and what he suspected. He told them about the dinner, about the documents that had looked thorough without quite answering the question. He told them about the way Verity had made him feel known, chosen, trusted, and how this feeling he now understood was itself a tool being used on him, a precision instrument of vulnerability. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it with the flat, accurate tone of a man reporting on terrain he has recently crossed. The Columbus police contacted Raymond Haas. Haas contacted the Ohio Banking Department. The 3-way conversation produced, within 2 weeks, a formal order requiring the American Prosperity Syndicate to cease taking new investments pending an audit of its operations. The order was served to the South High Street office on a Tuesday morning in mid-December, and one of the secretaries, the wife of Thomas Beale, signed for it, and then sat down in her chair and looked at the piece of paper for a very long time before she made any other movement. Clarence Verity was not in the office when the order was served. He was, by the account of the Indianapolis Bank, closing the American Prosperity Group account and receiving the funds in the form of a cashier's check. He was arrested at Union Station in Columbus 4 days later, carrying 2 suitcases and the cashier's check and the pocket watch that had belonged to no one. He was wearing a gray overcoat that he had recently purchased, and he looked, by the account of the officer who arrested him, entirely unsurprised. The subsequent investigation and legal proceedings took the better part of 18 months. What emerged was not a simple portrait of theft, but something more complicated and, in its complexity, more honest about what the American Prosperity Syndicate had actually been. Verity had stolen, unambiguously, in the pure legal sense. But the structure of the thing, the way it had worked, required examining the agency of everyone involved. And this examination was uncomfortable in ways that the newspapers, which covered the trial with considerable appetite, did not always capture. The investors were victims. This was the legal and moral finding, and it was correct. But they were also participants in a structure that could only function with their active assistance, their evangelical enthusiasm, their recruitment of neighbors and relatives. The men who had brought in others had done so genuinely, believing themselves messengers of good news. But the message itself required new recipients to remain true. They were unwitting architects of their own loss. This is the specific cruelty at the heart of every pyramid scheme. It converts goodwill into mechanism, transforms the human impulse to share good fortune into a structural necessity that keeps the machine running until it cannot. Dolores Quam testified at the trial. She sat in the witness chair in a gray wool dress and answered questions in a voice that was clear and precise and showed nothing of what 11 years of savings had meant to her, or what the partial return of that money and the prospect of recovering the rest had briefly made her feel possible. She said she had been told the returns were guaranteed. She said she had not been told the nature of the business with any specificity that she could verify. She said she had trusted the recommendation of a man she respected. She said all of this accurately, and it was all true, and it told most, but not all, of the story, because the full story included the part where she had wanted to believe, where the wanting had done some of the work that credulity is always asked to do. Clarence Verity was convicted of fraud, of theft, of operating a pyramid scheme, and of 2 counts related to the misrepresentation of investment securities under Ohio state law. He was sentenced to 8 years in the Ohio State Reformatory at Mansfield, and he served 5.5 before being released for good behavior, which, in his case, was perhaps an objective assessment. He was a model prisoner. He organized the prison library. He taught other inmates to read. He was polite to the guards and thoughtful in his interactions, and showed no signs of the contempt for other people that the crime he had committed would seem to require. This is one of the things that makes him difficult to resolve as a figure. The contempt was real. It must have been on some level to do what he did with such methodical efficiency. But it was not visible, or rather, what was visible was its opposite: a genuine interest in people, a real capacity for attention and warmth, and the kind of listening that makes people feel understood. Perhaps this is not a contradiction. Perhaps the interest was genuine, and the exploitation was also genuine. Both of them expressions of the same fundamental orientation toward other people as instruments of experience. Perhaps the warmth and the theft were not different things, but the same thing in different modes, the way that fire can illuminate a room and burn down a house. Harold Fitch received back approximately 60% of what he and the men he had recruited had invested. This was better than many of the later investors, who received nothing because the money had already left the system by the time they arrived. He used his portion to make a down payment on a house in Worthington, which he bought with his wife and eventually passed to his son, who still lives there now, or would have by the time this story settled into its permanent form. Harold never spoke about the American Prosperity Syndicate in public. He answered questions from investigators and attorneys with precision and without self-pity. But in his private life, it became the thing that was not mentioned, the negative space in the conversation, the room in the house whose door was always closed. Eugene Pruitt lived to be 89. In the last years of his life, when his grandchildren asked him about the most interesting thing he had ever done, he sometimes told them about the ledger, about sitting at the kitchen table and watching the numbers refuse to add up, about the letter he had written to the securities division in his careful accountant's hand. He did not frame it as heroism, and it was not heroism. It was simply arithmetic, and an old man's refusal to let arithmetic be overruled by wanting. This may be less dramatic than heroism, but is, in its own way, more rare. Dolores Quan recovered $190 of her $300 investment through the restitution proceedings, which returned to investors approximately 63 cents on the dollar in aggregate. She did not, in the end, buy the building she worked in. It was purchased by a property company from Cleveland in 1949, and she continued to rent her shop space there for 11 more years before finally, at the age of 51, opening a shop of her own in a different building on a different street. The new shop was smaller, but she owned it, or the bank owned it, and she was paying them, which is the American version of ownership, and it was real, and it was hers, in all the ways that matter when something is finally genuinely yours. What remains of the American Prosperity Syndicate now is almost nothing. A few newspaper articles on microfilm in the Columbus Dispatch archives, a folder in the Ohio Securities Division record, the transcript of the trial, which runs to 412 pages and contains within it the full texture of an American moment, the hunger and the hope, and the particular vulnerability of people who had survived something enormous and needed now to believe in something manageable, something that could be measured in monthly payments and written into a ledger. There is a specific kind of architecture that Clarence Verity built in 1945, and it is not unique to him or to his time. It is built in various forms, in various languages, in various clothing in every era, that produces the combination of abundance and inequality, and the corresponding human desire to find a way in through a door that has always been locked to you. The pyramid is not a shape that belongs to the past. It is a shape that belongs to hope, to the specific topology of hope when it encounters a closed system and looks for another way. Every generation builds it anew because every generation contains people who need to believe that the returns being promised are real, and because the geometry of longing has not changed since people first began wanting things they could not reach. We want to say that what Verity sold was nothing, that the American Prosperity Syndicate was empty at its core, a void dressed up in letterhead and mahogany and the language of solidarity. But this is not quite true. What he sold was real in its way. He sold people the experience of being seen, of being chosen, of belonging, however briefly, to something that called itself American in its very name and seemed to mean it as an invitation rather than an exclusion. He sold them a story in which they were the protagonists rather than the background figures, in which the hidden mechanisms of wealth were finally, at last, working in their favor. That this story was false does not entirely cancel the value of having lived inside it for a while, in the way that a dream can feel like a gift even after you have woken from it. But the waking matters. The waking is the part that costs. And what it cost Harold Fitch's neighbors, Dolores Quann's savings, Eugene Pruitt's trust, the machinist from Curtis Wright, the three men from the Ardennes, the pastor and the nurse, and the retired councilman, and the 340 people whose names appear in the syndicate's own records. What it cost them was not only money. It was a quantity of belief that, once spent in this way, is not easily replenished. The world replaces your money eventually, in part. It does not replace that other thing, the willingness to stand at a door and believe that when it opens, it will open for you. Columbus, Ohio, in the autumn of 1945, was a city of doors and the men and women who stood before them. Some were opened, some stayed shut. Some were opened by people who stood behind them with other intentions entirely, and then closed again before anyone inside had found their way to the window. Clarence Verity is buried in a small cemetery outside Columbus. His stone is plain because he died in 1981 with almost nothing, which is perhaps the universe's most restrained form of irony. The pocket watch that belonged to no one was returned to the evidence room and eventually lost. The leather briefcase, which had traveled with him from whatever beginning he had come from, was never adequately explained. The city goes on, as cities do, neither remembering nor entirely forgetting. The building on South High Street where the office was is something else now, has been something else several times over. The mahogany desk passed through an estate sale in an antique shop and may still exist somewhere, being polished by someone who does not know what agreements were made across its surface, what dreams were sold, what precisely the light looked like coming through the window that overlooked the parking lot on a winter morning in 1946, when everything still seemed possible and the eagles on the stationery still seemed to be flying somewhere specific, and the hunger of a whole nation was still looking for the hidden door that someone had promised was there.